Thank you, machine. That woman just follows me everywhere. I don't understand. Okay, so what I want to do tonight is share my screen, and if this will work, play 7 minutes of a YouTube of Ched Myers talking fairly recently about no, that's not true. It was a while ago about this subject, but at least it's 7 minutes of it for the Los Angeles Presbyterian. And then I have some more to share from him that is very fresh. But I wanted to do this. And then I also wanted to share something about that you might have seen today. It came on October 6th, which is just 4 days ago, about poverty in the US and what's happening. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. So anyway, it's all germane. So let me see if I can't share. Let me get what's his name up first. Okay.
We're thinking of Indigenous Peoples Day today too.
Right. This is going to actually come up in something that Ched was saying. Okay, so let me see if I can get it.
Founded in 1904,
What
the
happened?
first
Oh, here we go.
Black Presbyterian congregation, as I understand it, west of the Mississippi. So there's some history here.
So now you need to share your screen. There you
Yeah.
Need to
Did I
be
get it?
back with you again in these
Yep.
There we go.
Presbyterian conversations.
Sound gets better.
About the roots of violence, and today I've been invited to make some framing comments about the roots of poverty. Heidi, I look forward to the time when you invite me to do something a little bit easier. But in fact, these are the most important conversations we could be having as a church. This morning, I'm mindful that in 18 months from now, we'll be commemorating the 25th anniversary of the 1992 Los Angeles uprising. See, poverty, too, has a terrible cost. And we're gathered here today to wrestle with that. Now, our job as people of faith is to probe deeper than the presenting symptoms of poverty. Our churches should be committed to embracing a radical response. For biblical faith, inequality matters profoundly. The problem is we middle-class folk tend to be preoccupied with tending to our own affluenza. Get rich quick. There's not much of a mission statement, is it now, Mr. Brubaker? And part of that problem is that we Christians, as Jesuit John Hoey famously put it, tend to read the gospel as if we had no money and spend our money as if we know nothing of the gospel. Well, I guess that's why Presbyterians like to do theology first, to try to get the story right. So let's recall that the biblical story of redemption began with the realities of social disparity. This fact is an inconvenient but unavoidable reality check in our tradition. God hears the cry of the poor first. Without attention to the pain of poverty, Alexia talked about seeing folk in pain. Without that, there can be no exodus, no journey to freedom and justice. So as you know, the Hebrew slaves staged a massive walkout of Pharaoh's Egypt. But what's really interesting to observe is what comes next after the walkout, because it's a catechism in economics. Here's the setup. Turns out that the ancient Israelites, sort of like us modern North Americans, just couldn't imagine a social system apart from the Egyptian political, military, economic complex that they were used to, despite the fact that those Hebrews were at the bottom of that social pyramid. So the first thing they do in the wilderness, as you know, is to pine for their former oppression, proving the truth of the old African-American adage, easier to get the people out of Egypt than to get Egypt out of the people. It seems that the Israelites had internalized imperial appetites and desires, which made it difficult for them to break their dependence upon the very system that marginalized them. Man, does that sound familiar? In response to the Israelites' complaints, Yahweh responds, All right, here's the deal. I'm going to rain bread from heaven. Exonerating us from the struggle to eradicate poverty was reminding his disciples that our social location should always be proximate to those who suffer. The text is translated, the poor will always be in your midst, which we can also translate, you will always be with the poor. It is a statement of the church's social location, not about the inevitability of poverty. Now, we'd understand this if we were a bit more literate in the left side of our Bibles, because Jesus is actually alluding to another important Sabbath economics text found in Deuteronomy 15, which articulates a whole program to deconstruct poverty in Israel through debt relief and mutual aid. That text begins by pointing out that if debt relief is practiced faithfully by the community, there will be no one in need. And that's the goal. But scripture is realistic, and so the second half of this text acknowledges that our practices are imperfect, such that needs will always arise, and when they do, the command is to respond with generous justice, not to accept poverty as inevitable, but to reach out your hand to your neighbor. That's the text Jesus is citing. Who knew? This Sabbath economics vision runs throughout the law and the prophets. From the 7th-year Sabbath in Exodus 23 that leaves fields to the poor, to the super Sabbath of the Jubilee year in which all debts are forgiven, slaves freed, and land returned to the homeless, Leviticus 25. A structural adjustment to try to prevent economic stratification from becoming permanent. We see it in the assertion of gleaners' rights at every harvest in Leviticus 19. Matsunaga concludes that Los Angeles is one of only 2 major U.S. cities in which concentrated poverty, that's a technical term, meaning census tracts, in which 40% or more of households are below the poverty line. Concentrated poverty became more prevalent in Los Angeles between 1990 and 2000. One of only 2 cities in the nation. Los Angeles, we have a problem. Residents of these neighborhoods, here's something not surprising, are disproportionately Latino and Black, and increasingly foreign-born persons who face language barriers. Also not surprising, these folks in these concentrated poverty tracts are less likely to be employed and more likely to be out of the labor force. And they are 2/3 more adversely impacted than residents in the rest of the city by issues such as housing insecurity, young adults at risk, immobility, maternal health outcomes, educational attainment, and public safety. Okay, so that's Matsunaga's report, 2008.
If you're an Oregon homeowner, 2022 is your last chance to go solar. In December of 2020, Congress passed an
It's our
extension
last
of solar
chance.
investment credit, which pays homeowners an average of $9,880 to install solar panels. See how much you can be paid for going solar by taking the Go Solar quiz below. Time for a secret? The solar investment credit is the only reason so many of your neighbors have.
Okay, got that done.
Did it. Yay.
I forgot where it came from. Okay. Sorry. Let me get the rest of it off. Where'd it go?
Oh no, how cute.
Your panels produce. Because the government and your utility companies
Okay.
both offer different green energy incentives, it's almost impossible to understand which ones are applicable to you. Click the link below, take the 30-second solar quiz, and find out exactly what's available at your home.
Okay.
Glad you recorded this for everybody.
Yes, it'll demonstrate our technical savvy for everyone.
The first time I've ever shared my screen, so it had to happen.
Good job. I think you did great. We all saw it.
Okay, it's good. I had to have that little growing pain. Great. Okay. So I'm going to want to share my screen again.
I just wonder what that other city was. He said that was one of two.
Yeah, he didn't say what it was. Yeah. But that was just when the stock market was going absolutely nuts over the .com thing, the boom.
Chilling.
Yeah, it's really chilling. So obviously only a certain number of people make money. And it doesn't lift all boats, not now or ever, probably. So what I'd like to
I should blur my background.
do is, let me see if I can't spread this out. All right, here we go. All right, I'm going to share it again. I can find us all. Shoot. All right, that's not going to work, is it? Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen one more time. See what happens. Right. Oh, there it is. Great. You got it?
Yes.
The good and the bad and the ugly and the latest poverty numbers from October 6th. This just came out. Recently, the US Census released the latest figures on poverty. The top line numbers certainly gave reason to cheer. Yet, as we looked at the broader picture, it is far from rosy. Here is the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good news, child poverty fell drastically. From 220 to 221, child poverty didn't just fall, it plummeted. National figures showed 40% drop in the official childhood poverty rate from 9.7% to 5.2% in a year. Last year's figure was a record low. This historic drop in the childhood poverty rate is largely due to the expansion of the child tax credit, a refundable credit that provides monthly cash payments to families with children. In Oregon, that benefit went to an estimated 763,000 children. That's amazing. According to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, had the child tax credit not been expanded in 2021, 2.1 million more children in the US would have faced severe economic hardship. Most of the money from the expanded child tax credit went to pay for essentials like food and rent. At the start of the school year, families spent the money on school expenses, meaning like books, supplies, tutoring, and after-school programs. These patterns were particularly the case among Black, Latino, and other families of color. With a simple fix, getting cash into the pockets of families, Congress illuminated a path to ending child poverty, which not all of Congress admits happens. The bad news, unless Congress acts quickly, the gains won't last. Congress let the child tax credit expansion expire at the end of 221. Congress failed to take action, resulting in about 750,000 children in Oregon getting cut off from the added support. Many of these children, Oregon children, and their families will fall back into poverty due to congressional inaction. All hope is not lost. Congress can still take a stand against child poverty and reinstate the expansions to the child tax credit. There's an opportunity to take action as part of a bipartisan year-end legislation. Policymakers must prioritize expanding the child tax credit, especially as the rich and powerful push to advance their own interests with more tax cuts for corporations. The ugly and outdated poverty line understates economic insecurity. Though lifting people out of poverty is a good thing, the sad reality is that rising above the poverty line is no assurance of being economically secure, not by a long shot. Poverty as a measure of economic hardship is outdated and inadequate. For a family of three to be considered poor in 222, they must earn less than $23,000, an amount that is far too little to survive on. While increasing family incomes, any amount is a victory. We cannot settle for children being merely above the poverty line. So anyway, wanted to get those two things out there for us as we now kind of talk about it. What grabbed you? Anything?
Yeah, the good news that so many children were lifted out of poverty has been reported widely, and yet Congress very possibly won't do anything to continue it because it might make Biden look good.
Is that what it is?
That's what
Well, partly that's that, and partly it's making Biden not look good, and partly it's just that's not what they believe in doing. They believe in all kinds of other excuses for why people are just responsible for their own fortune, and those are those children, and probably immigrants, and I mean,
Robert
how
Reich.
they're helping them.
I'm sure everybody knows who Robert Reich is. He had a great piece in The Guardian. I read it yesterday. I don't know if it was just written yesterday about, why are we still talking about trickle down economics?
Right.
It doesn't trickle down, never did. Why are some people still thinking that that's a winning formula?
Right.
another
A
thing
lot-
he said this week that I thought was brilliant, really important, was he talked about what we measure, and he said, we measure the unemployment rate, we measure inflation, the cost of things. We do not measure corporate profits. And that's because corporations won't even report their profits. So we don't have, like, every quarter, we're not hearing, oh, profits are up 20% this year, or they're up 30% this year. We don't hear that. So we don't hear that as part of the reason why inflation is up. We just blame, other things that we do measure. It's a clear example of what you don't measure, you don't pay attention to. And so he suggests that we have to find a way to measure corporate profits and report that.
Now, who said?
Well,
Robert
it's-
Reich.
Oh, it was Reich, okay.
And it's a case of the very, very rich making the rules,
Right. They don't want it measured. They won't report it.
right?
Except
Well,
to
individual
stockholders.
corporations report their profits, but nobody's putting the numbers together.
Right.
Well, even individual ones, they just do it on a periodic basis to their shareholders, and they don't do it for public consumption. It's not like the monthly number that you want to come up with. Anyway, that's just another thing he said that I thought was really significant this week.
One thing that you see in the Gospel of Luke that Jed Myers talks about in something else I'd like to share later. He gets kind of at the root of why trickle down economics doesn't work. I mean, it would work, right, if people were generous at the top. If they said, we don't want to make 237 times what the lowest paid worker makes. We only want to make 40 times, which would make me blush. Anyway, but no. So, I mean, that's greed, right? Is it greed? What is it? That's too big
Greed.
a word. That's too big a word for it, but
It is greed, but it's also making sure that there's always an us and them, and making sure that the people who make the rules are part of us and all the rest of the people are them.
And a lack of empathy for people who are not wealthy.
yeah.
We seem to want to create multi-billionaires and then thank them for their generosity for handing it out. And it's the same thing that was going on, 130 years ago or so with the robber barons back then. That we applauded Andrew Carnegie for building libraries and all that good stuff. I mean, I'm actually sitting in an example of this because we've been visiting Acadia National Park, which was all a big gift from John D. Rockefeller, and all these wonderful things that all his money built here. And it's really nice, good to look at, but it's not really generosity when we have an economic system designed to create super wealthy people, and then we need to beg them for donations to get things done.
So let me put Diane's comment about us and them together with our the robber barons. My favorite story about Andrew Carnegie is that when he got pushback from unions for building libraries and endowing symphonies and operas and museums, instead of giving his workers the money so they make more money, his answer was, oh, you'll just spend it on a better cut of beef. I want to do something with my money that makes a difference. And, as someone who likes the opera and the symphony and loves it when rich people endow it, I clap, at the beginning when so-and-so named Schnitzer gives the money for something. Right. Part of me goes, yeah, which is probably the reason I need to think about that, right? It's an us versus them thing. It's like, it's us who appreciate opera and symphony and museums, and those lowlifes, all they do is eat more meat.
Well, it needs to be a both and thing. I mean, you need to start with being fair to your workers and having enough jobs for everyone and having a society that provides enough for everyone. And then if there's excess, I mean, nobody's against all profit. And if there's excess and people want to support those kinds of things too, that's fine.
But we as a society can support those things if everyone has enough. Because right now, even though we have those wonderful things that many of us in this room get to enjoy, a whole bunch of people don't get to enjoy them. They can't possibly afford it.
Right.
When I was still teaching the ballet, I started to say Houston, sorry, the Portland Ballet gave our kindergarten, first and second graders an opportunity to have 6 classes with an instructor, and then we got to attend 3 performances. I am absolutely certain that the children in my class, well, none of them obviously had ever been to one before. Of course, they were 6 also, so that's not terribly shocking. But I would be very surprised if their parents had been either. So it's a wonderful thing, but again, this should be accessible to everyone.
And this is a very American thing. I mean, it's not nearly as skewed in Europe, in other places. It's our choice, and it's always been our choice.
Yep.
So it's a cultural thing. We don't know, how to deal with this and how to change the attitudes.
We hold billionaires in very high esteem.
Is it true? I've always thought, is it true that European countries in particular have much better public support for the arts than we do? I mean, it's even in our schools. The arts are the first things to be cut.
Yeah.
Have a budget problem, but in many other countries, there's public support for the arts, public support for artists.
Mhm.
And I'd say it's very popular, but 3 years ago, I thought briefly that I would go to Scandinavia via Hanover, which has a new, recently, the last few years. Always get phone calls during these things. Concert space there. And I couldn't figure out how to get tickets because you couldn't get them 6 months out. But 6 months and 3 days later, they were all sold out.
People used to comment on, they go to Russia, because it was a lark, they've been to England and France, so they're going to Russia, and they go to Russia, and they're in the taxi cabs, and the taxi cab drivers are talking about the performance they saw of Shostakovich's, Second Symphony the week before, and there's no us versus them. Everybody loved the symphony. They were talking about the way American cab drivers, if there are any left, would talk about Chicago Cubs or something else like that.
Mhm.
So that's interesting. What do you make of Jed Meyer's reference right out of the box to the manna story And the children of Israel, just, fresh out of Egypt, missing leeks and onions and saying, we hate this manna, you're trying to kill us. That there's an us versus them thing there too. I mean, they're lowlifes, right? What are we to make of that?
Well, we all become a part of the culture in which we're living. And so I guess we shouldn't be surprised. I loved that part in the book where he discussed that, because I hadn't thought about it that way before. I thought about it the way of, oh, boring, the same thing every day. But yeah, I just came from a book club discussion of The Girl with a Louding Voice, and talking about how a very wealthy woman who had enslaved the main character beat her, and she had been beaten. She just bought into this culture that, to hold herself in higher esteem, she had to make this person who was her slave, really, because she didn't pay her, less. And that was the culture she came from. These working girls were just not worthy of money.
To go back to the trickle down thing again, you guys mentioned, I found it so interesting that the Conservative Party in England, has their new prime minister, because that's the way the system worked there. This time out, they could only have one no confidence vote, so the next person had to be elected by less than 1% of the whole country voted for Liz Truss. Somehow I can't even get my mind around how that worked. But anyway, so she's there, and the first thing she does, right, is give
Tax cuts.
huge tax breaks to the 1%. I mean, the biggest since the 1950s or something like that.
That's right.
But I mean, it sends shockwaves everywhere. Like,
Awful.
what? I mean, it's good to see the reaction, but it's also, as you say, sobering that this idea of trickle down has not been debunked, even in a place where they're pretty darn smart. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we had a president who had to stand up every Wednesday and answer and take questions from the opposition and everybody else? That at least they'd have to know what they're talking about. I mean, to some degree, right?
But they're so brazen. I mean, they say this stuff with an absolute straight face.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult.
That's just fascinating.
I have a little trouble talking about poverty in the United States, having lived in Mexico where there is extreme poverty. And, reading about, the beautiful forevers in India and starving people in Africa. And here we're talking about not being able to go to the ballet as some measure of poverty. I have some trouble with that, because I think we need to look beyond our borders when we talk about need and about, I liked when he said that it's not that the poor will always be with us, but that we should always be amidst the poor, and that the church should be centered in areas of concentrated poverty. And I think there's a powerful message there. And I think for me personally, it goes beyond looking at the poverty in our country, which is, really a different issue than people who are actually starving, unable to go to school, have no housing. I mean, extreme poverty is in the world.
And we do have some of that here.
We do.
We have an increasing amount of that here, to be honest. But I do hear you.
Of hunger, at least,
I know
yeah.
what you're saying.
Hunger
And houselessness, lots and lots of houselessness.
True, there's homelessness and people living on the streets, but they're
Right.
not living in cardboard houses and considering themselves lucky to have it. I mean, where that's just the norm.
And I think I
Garbage.
also thought about poverty as, I know there are differences in absolute levels of possession and wealth and so forth across the world. But some of it has to do with where you sit in society and how hopeless you feel. When I lived in Taiwan, I visited people who lived in pre-war Japanese houses where the kitchen floor was dirt, and and the house was what we would consider very substandard. They did not consider themselves poor because they were educated, they had hope, they were kind of in the middle of society. And here, somebody living in the same kind of situation might have a lot fewer options than they had because of their level in society in Taiwan. So it's not just about absolute levels, it's also about relative levels and the kind of hope you have for what you want to be able to do with your life in society, or whether you have any choices at all.
Well, or the attitude that the society has toward you.
Mhm.
And I think the biggest problem that we have is that we blame the poor for poverty. We blame jobless people for unemployment. We blame homeless people for homelessness. And so if you are poor or homeless or uneducated or whatever in the United States, society looks at you as morally deficient because of it.
We blame women for being raped.
Mhm. And that produces family dysfunction and, and generational problems and all of that kind of thing.
I do appreciate, the work of people like Bill and Melinda Gates, who look at the big picture and decide that, let's eradicate polio because it will relieve so much suffering. And it's absolutely right. It's something you can do that, could in fact be more than feeding people for another season. Because those folks are so vulnerable to malaria or polio or smallpox, whatever it is that we need to give them a leg up from. So it's tricky. I wonder sometimes if the super rich are doing all these things and we hear about it, if people think that's just enough.
Well, most super rich aren't even doing it. It's just a few that
Right.
are.
It's just a few. They do enlist each other. They do try to convert each other, which I give them credit for too.
Warren
Well,
Buffett is
I
very
mean,
good
there's
at that.
definitely some good stories about rich
Yeah.
people doing
Right.
things like that, like the Patagonia guy the other week gave his
Right.
company
That's a
away.
good one.
Who was that? Oh, the guy, yeah, we talked about from Patagonia, right? Well, and Warren Buffett's kind of amazing in that he lives in, I drove by his house. It doesn't look like anything special.
It's just a house in West Omaha.
Yeah.
You guys ought to be paying more taxes, by the way.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's level-headed, and I don't understand people who never have enough. It simply doesn't make sense. But there's something about that, and there's something also, I guess, about proving that you're still richer than your neighbor or something. Competitive stuff. Can't hear you, Dan. You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, the rich people that are the most obnoxious and entitled seem to be the second and third generations. The Betsy DeVosses and the Donald Trumps and the people that didn't actually earn their money, but but inherited it and think they're absolutely entitled to keep every penny of it.
Yeah. Kind of true. So next week, Ched's going to be talking about, is it Luke, a parable of the unjust, not unjust judge, but unjust manager, right? The dishonest manager. I preached on it just a month ago or so, and he's doing it partly because it's been in the lectionary. Anyway, all of Luke is just full of this stuff. I just tell you, maybe this is apropos of nothing, but you tell me, back in 2004, it was summertime, the end of summer, and a person from my church in Ashland came to see me, wanted to have a meeting. So he came to my office, and I knew he was one of the more conservative people in that church. And he wanted me to promise him that I wouldn't preach about politics before what happened was the re-election of George Bush, who was running against John Kerry in 2004. So, I felt he's probably right. I don't need to talk about politics. There's only, 6 or 7 weeks before the election in November. But the texts were all from Luke, and the same ones. And it's just one
Hard to avoid it.
rich and poor after the other. So I was just, I was pulling my hair out trying to figure out how to not talk about the elephant in the living room, the GOP elephant in the living room. And so this particular Sunday, in that melange of Sundays, it was all about the rich and the poor again. And I thought, I'm not going to say anything about George Bush, even though I'd done that before. I wasn't going to say anything about him. But I said, if you watch Fox News, be careful, because it's owned by Rupert Murdoch and he panders to the rich. I think that's almost a direct quote of what I said. And the world ended. There was all this. I went to the back of this was the traditional service. So I go to the back of the church for people to walk out, and there's buzzing like I never heard. And I think, something must be up. And I didn't realize all these people were watching Fox News. And I was in, so I'm looking, and through the line comes this woman who looks familiar to me, though I'd never met her before, and she's got this look on her face like, you're toast. and then her husband comes next, and her husband's Ben Weir, who was the moderator of the General Assembly and was a hostage in Lebanon. And he takes both my hands and shakes it wildly and says, "You're a prophet." And then this next woman in line takes me apart, whose daughter I had been with through her stroke at the age of 50. I'm going on here, aren't I?
That's interesting. Keep going.
And she just would not stop. And she and her husband left the church over it, because I said, well, I told her about this meeting I'd had, and I wasn't going to say anything about politics. So I thought I should at least say this because of the text in the Bible.
Well,
And I don't care what you say about the president, but Fox News, that's the only balanced news on television.
Oh my
Right.
goodness.
Fair and balanced.
Fox News.
Fair and balanced. Just ask them.
Which just proves if you say it enough times, somebody will believe you. In fact, a lot of bodies will believe you.
So it's Jed's correct. The Luke passages are incredible on this, and most people ignore them and preach anything else, right?
Why?
Yeah.
What do the scholars say? What is it about Luke?
Well, I can give you a little bit more from Ched himself, from a sermon he gave, I guess a sermon or some talk he gave in August. No, July, I think it was. Yeah. He says, and he's always talking about Luke 12, where Jesus says, be careful of greed. Anyway, take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. That's the traditional text. And he says, when we approach this text, we need to acknowledge that economics is exceedingly difficult to talk about in most of our churches, more taboo than politics or sex. Jesuit theologian John Hoffey summarized the dilemma, which we just heard in that other talk. We read the Gospels as if we had no money, and we spend our money as if we know nothing of the gospel.
You should use that in church as, you're like
One of the
little proverbs to ponder.
Yeah, that'd be good. Well, try to
That would
put
be a good one.
Yeah. Yet no aspect of our individual and corporate lives is more determinative of our personal and political world than economics, and few subjects are more frequently addressed in our scriptures. Most folks in our churches have no context for apprehending the teaching of Jesus regarding economic justice. That's because we're also deeply socialized with simple fairy tale-like narratives of capitalism, which swirls around us every day. So the gospel perspective on the subject literally doesn't compute. I think that's exactly right. And for the same reason, neither do we have eyes to see the actual story of capitalism as it plays out. There's, however, an alternative economic narrative in Scripture. Okay, so we know all about that.
That's really good, though. That's
Yeah, that was a good opening. Okay, the essential expression of Sabbath economics is found in old Exodus tale of the manna in the wilderness, right? But he expands on this nicely here, which sustained the Hebrews after they were liberated from slavery in imperial Egypt. This account is not about trusting God, as we learned in Sunday school, which is exactly right. I mean, that's the thing about this. That's how insidious this is. If we only think the manna story is about us, right? And we're supposed to be patient because God's going to help us win the lottery maybe next year, not this year, whatever, right? But he says, no, the text says specifically that the gift of manna is a test to see whether Israel will follow divine instructions on how to realize Yahweh's alternative economy. These instructions are 3, which is what? The gift should be distributed equitably, Exodus 16. Make sure it circulates rather than concentrating in one place, Exodus 16:19. And keep the Sabbath. Limit human activity as a constant reminder of the economy of grace. I don't know. That's a harder one to swallow.
Well, it's still good. I think those are good teachings that certainly those would be welcome at Southminster,
Yeah.
I think, and good to remember. I mean, we need to hear that.
Yeah. Okay. This narrative is
I
granted.
do. I'm over here accumulating all my treasures, so you gotta remind me.
This narrative is grounded in 2 cosmological principles, which in turn shape the prophetic message in both testaments, including and perhaps especially Luke's gospel. It is shown in Jesus's wilderness feedings of the poor in Luke 9, and told in the central petition of the Lord's Prayer, give us today enough bread to get by. But it is particularly reflected in Luke's sharp critique of the rich. This thread is rooted also in the alternative version of the manna story, which we find in Numbers 11. So there's 2 manna stories. There's the Exodus one and the Numbers one. And the Numbers one is more of a warning. Here the people begin compulsively over-consuming the divine gift of manna and quail and begin to die of plague related directly to their inability to self-limit. Okay.
Really?
That's what it says here. Begin to die of a plague related directly to their inability to self-limit. This trauma.
Learn that in Sunday
Again,
school.
this is Numbers 11. Yeah.
It's about gluttony. No, I never learned that.
This trauma inspires a place name, which is Kibroth Hateva, which means the graves of greed.
Wow.
Okay. The graves of greed motif underscores a harsh lesson. Those who suffered from not enough as slaves in Egypt are just as capable of taking too much, given the opportunity. And the disease of too much, what we today called affluenza, is the essential plague that makes both poverty and ecological overdraw inevitable.
Wow.
So we must be ever vigilant against our own potential for generating plagues of greed. And this is the teaching that Jesus takes up in our gospel text.
And which text is that one?
Luke 12, 7-9, no, 13 to 21.
Yeah.
I will send you this whole thing. It's
Okay, yeah, send an email.
yeah, that's what I'll do.
So what can we do to share how cool this will be to have him next week so that maybe a few more people will come? Because I think that he is really dynamic and
Yeah,
I
maybe we
could
could,
share something on like Southminster Connections. We could share a little clip.
I could
of-
send that 7-minute clip from YouTube out generally to everyone this Thursday. So they could
Why
take
don't
a
you do that? And we could
Yeah.
also post that link on our Facebook page for Southminster Connections so that people could just have a glimpse of him before next Thursday.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm wondering, Kathy, you had a suggestion last week when we were having trouble with the link that maybe Lisa could do an all church blast like we do on Sunday morning to say, here's the link for today's service. That
Could do
perhaps
that for his guest appearance. That might be
Yeah,
worth
for
it.
the occasion of his guest appearance next Monday that
Yeah.
might warrant doing
Yeah,
something
let's do
like that.
Let's do
I
that.
think that's a great idea.
Because I think it would be great. And I think people would really enjoy it, and everybody gets busy. And, maybe in general, they don't want to do a Monday night class for 6 weeks, but
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think that would be.
Are we going past next Sunday? I mean, next Monday?
That's week 3.
Yeah, we said we do probably 6 at least. And there's plenty more to talk about. So yeah, we can,
But we should have some topics in mind or some ways to,
yeah.
It'll be interesting to see. I mean, we can be flexible. We're good at it.
Definitely we could do one the following week to talk about, continue on whatever it
Yeah.
was that he talked
Yeah.
about.
Do you want
That's
to keep
what-
recording this part?
I can stop recording now.
I
Oh,
mean,
it's okay. I don't think it's a bad thing.
it isn't that it's bad, it's just
Telling our secrets, yeah.
no, it's not that, it's just that it's not on the topic, it's